Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be able to welcome you on behalf of the OECD Biodiversity, Land Use and Ecosystems Program and the United Nations Development Program Biodiversity Finance Initiative. We're here today starting our day 2 of the virtual series. We had last week on Wednesday, the 15th of April, we had sessions 1 and 2. Which was session 1 was on the state of global biodiversity finance in 2020, and session 2 was on tracking biodiversity expenditures and effective budgeting. And today we start in the morning with session 3, which is on identifying and reforming subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. My name is Katya Karusakis. I lead the biodiversity work at the OECD, and I'd like to thank all of you so much for joining today. We have an excellent panel of speakers. I'll get to this in a moment. But I'd just like to highlight, first of all, that this issue in particular on identifying and reforming subsidies harmful to biodiversity is a critical issue in this broader context of scaling up action and finance for biodiversity. And I'm so happy you can join us. Without further ado, what I'm going to do is share my screen with the opening information. So, the program we have for today is, I'm going to briefly start as the moderator. And also provide some guidance on how all the participants can listen in, get engaged via chatting in the functions, etc., and raising your hand so you can ask questions, etc. The objective of today's session overall is to share concrete experiences on identifying and assessing subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity, as well as on the experiences from countries on how they have gone about to go ahead and reform these subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. We have an excellent panel of speakers. I'm so happy to have them here. They really are experts in their fields, leaders in this domain. Starting off with Kai Schlegelmich from Germany, from the Federal Ministry of the Environment. He's going to be speaking to how they're looking at the issue of identifying and assessing harmful subsidies from the German perspective. We will then be followed by Greti Lucaroni and Aldo Ravazzi from Italy, who will be going through how they're looking at both environmentally harmful subsidies and biodiversity harmful subsidies. We're then, because we are trying to make this as interactive as we possibly can, we'll have a quick poll for you to ask you some questions. You'll see the poll coming up and we encourage you all to respond. We'll follow after those first 2 presentations with a general discussion where you're very welcome to ask your questions. We do encourage you also to be asking questions as the presentations are being presented from myself, from Kai and Aldo in the chat function. That way the presenters will be able to think about those questions and how to respond to them as we're moving through the presentation. And then we're going to move to the second part, which is will be 2 presentations. The first by Gabriela Blatter from the Federal Office for the Environment in Switzerland, talking about agricultural subsidy reform and how it's benefiting biodiversity in Switzerland, how they went about that, some of the key lessons on how they learned to overcome barriers to effective policy reform. And finally, a presentation from Lira Zoldubaeva from UNDP Biofin, sharing on the experience on the issue of reforming harmful subsidies to biodiversity from Kyrgyzstan. Before we move into, though, the substantive session, as I said, I would very like to quickly go through some guidance for the participants. First of all, we would like to ask you all if you can rename yourself as participants. To do this, you go to the participants window, and when you see your name, if you can click on rename, and you can change that to first name, last name, and country organization. Please, we're putting everyone on mute to prevent background noise, but if you would like to ask a question via the raise hand function, we will unmute you so that you can speak directly. We do generally prefer to be able to take your questions from the chat window directly. So if you're chatting, if you put in text in the chat window, and please also identify who the question is geared to, if it's geared specifically to a particular person, or if it's, please also feel free to share your own insights as you're hearing other examples. And as I said, you can also raise your hand from the participants window. If you have technical issues, again in the participants window, we have listed the people who are there to help, including Ekin and Gamze from the UNDP program. Also from our team, Nasera and Ines are there to help as well. So with that as a general introduction, I'm going to start with why this is such an important issue and why it's really important to try and identify and assess and monitor the biodiversity and environmentally harmful subsidies that may be prevalent in a domestic setting. Overall, so far we've been talking about in the context of CBD COP and for our biodiversity agenda as a whole, also through the Sustainable Development Goals, etc., that we really need to scale up both action and finance for biodiversity in order to be able to achieve the outcomes we want, the end goals, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. But equally important also is to reform the subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. And if you were there in session 1, Edward presented on some overview of the relative numbers between the positive flows and the harmful flows. Currently, from the data that's available today, the harmful flows to biodiversity are around 5 times higher than the positive flows to biodiversity. So really we're pushing in the wrong direction, and we need much more action in order to change this balance. In terms of the international picture, I think many of us are already aware of Aichi Target 3 under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which encourages countries to reform, eliminate, and phase out their subsidies, including the incentives that are harmful to biodiversity. Today, as countries are negotiating towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, if you see Target 12 in the Zero Draft Framework, there's again specific language on this issue, drawing from Target 3. And I'd also like to point to the informal advisory group on biodiversity mainstreaming that also contributed a document for the Rome workshop that took place in February, which was, and in this regard, Goal 2, which is on positive incentives and harmful incentives, and also includes indicators, proposed indicators against which we can monitor progress in this area. So that's the context. What I'd like to begin with is just highlight sort of the overview in terms of if you would like to go ahead and reform your environmentally harmful subsidies. What are some of the issues that you need to address? And most of these are issues that we're going to be addressing in this session as well. So first of all, admitting that certain subsidies might actually be causing some problems. Then having good information on the size and the nature of these subsidies. And this is what the presentations from Germany and Italy will be covering. Also understanding the effects of the subsidies and their reform on the economic, social, and environmental indicators, etc. And also then, of course, learning from the lessons of past examples of reform. This is what the 2 presentations are really about from Gabriela Blatter and Lira. and then going ahead to develop realistic reforms and also leveraging international collective action to legitimize domestic action. So what I'd like to highlight as well is that at the OECD, we have a number of different data sets across the house. And I'm going to highlight the three ones that are relevant to biodiversity as well. The first one here is on agricultural support to farmers. So there are about nearly 50 countries that are reporting data to this data set on agricultural support. And here you see over time the type of support that is classified as potentially most environmentally harmful, least harmful, and other. You see the trends from 1990 to 2018. We do update this data as frequently as the data becomes available, and on an annual basis. I mean, the 2019 data will be available soon. But as you can see here, for example, the agricultural support that is considered most environmentally harmful has been declining over time up until 2017, with a slight increase in 2018. This is data for the OECD, but other countries are also contributing to this database. We have some examples here below. And we welcome all countries to report to this database so that we can track over time, if we're achieving our objectives in this regard. In terms of the methodology, it's explained in another publication. Because of time constraints, I don't want to go into this too much here. Just to highlight that some examples of the potentially most environmentally harmful types of support include market price support, payments based on commodity output, and payments based on variable input use in cases where they're not imposing environmental constraints on farming practices. So this is one set of information. We also collect information from countries on government support to fisheries. This is under our fisheries support estimate database, which contains information on these various issues you see here, services to the sector, such as for management, enforcement, or support, and as well as direct support to individuals and companies such as fuels, vessels, or income. At the present time in 2016, there were 33 countries reporting to this database. It is increasing over time. And based on this, around over 3 billion was spent on these specific type of measures, which lower the cost of variable inputs, on measures such as subsidies for vessel construction, and the other ones mentioned here. Again, we welcome all countries to report, and there's the contact information down below. Oh, we're stuck again. Here we go. Okay. In terms of tracking fossil fuel subsidies, fossil fuel support is among the largest flows of public finance that is potentially harmful to biodiversity. Incentives, as we know, the incentives for the use and production of fossil fuels contributes to climate change, which is one of the 4 largest drivers on biodiversity loss. And based on the figure you see here, in 2017, based on 76 predominantly OECD and G20 economies, so 76 economies, they spent about 340 billion in fossil fuel support in that year. You do see the trends here over time as well. And so while fossil fuel support declined, for example, between 2013 to 2016, this progress has showed signs of slowing, whereby fossil fuel subsidy support increased by 5% between 2016 and 2017. in terms of supporting countries to look at fossil fuel subsidies and how to reform them as well, there is the G20 peer review on this issue, which is chaired by the OECD, with countries such as Indonesia, Italy, China, Germany, Mexico, and the USA, which have already undergone these voluntary peer reviews, and Argentina and Canada forthcoming, and France and India have expressed interest in this. I just also very quickly like to highlight, we are developing national level guidance to identify and assess subsidies harmful to biodiversity. We're looking at the countries such as France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and the other few countries that have actually undertaken these national level assessments to compare their scope, their methodologies, and other issues. And then we're going to compare that with the top-down methods so as to develop this national level guidance. It's going to follow in a similar way a report that's coming out very soon on guidance to reform support for fossil fuels and in the OECD and G20 countries. In terms of lessons to overcome barriers to policy reform, I'm just going to highlight this very quickly. Gabriela will be speaking to this as well, as we had one of the case studies in this report was from Switzerland. And just to finish off here in terms of some relevant OECD work, if you're interested in further reading afterwards. So with that, I'm going to hopefully pass on the floor to Kai. I do have his slides here because Kai also had some technical issues. Shall I go again? I'm gonna go again into the full share mode, and I hope that that works. Okay. Kai, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Okay, well, thank you very much for the pleasure and honor to present fiscal instruments for biodiversity in Germany with a focus on biodiversity harmful subsidies. Next slide, please. How did we identify and assess and track biodiversity harmful subsidies? Let me point out three main guiding questions. Which sectors should you examine? Well, start with those which have the largest impact on biodiversity and land use, but then get further inspiration from other countries and international reports. Second question, why choose certain sectors? Well, we chose agriculture because this has the largest share of land use, more than 50% in general. That's why it has the largest impact on biodiversity as well. And apart from land use, climate change is very important because it is a serious threat to biodiversity. And so energy and transport sectors are the next sectors you should look at. Which methodologies did we use? Is my third question. Well, the first very important one is look at tax rates which are lower than the normal ones, which means you have some exemptions or reduced rates, and they are a very good indicator for harmful subsidies. If there are direct payments, like in the case of the Common Agricultural Policy in the European Union, and if they are made without any environmental conditions, then this is also an indication for a harmful subsidy. Next slide, please. What are the results of biodiversity harmful subsidies? In Germany, we found in 3 areas overall 55 billion euros of harmful subsidies. First, in the housing and transport area, 2 examples. There is a commuting lump sum income tax reduction for all commuters, and also a tax subsidy for diesel, which means a tax differential of 18 cents that diesel is taxed lower than gasoline, and that is not justified. This makes 8.6 billion euros. Second area is agriculture and bioenergy. Here we have 2 examples. There are direct payments of the EU Common Agricultural Policy, and a second example is the reduction of value-added taxes for animal products like meat and milk. This makes 13.5 billion euros. The third largest issue is actually climate harmful subsidies in the energy sector. Like we have many energy reductions for several sectors and lower energy tax rates, particularly for most harmful fossil fuels. Overall 55 billion euros. That is about 6% of our total budget volume. Next slide, please. But we also identified that there should be compensation payments for physical impacts of non-internalized external costs. Now, the non-internalization of external costs are a kind of subsidy, and therefore they need to be compensated by, for example, levying a tax on the excessive use of fertilizers. So, for example, a so-called nitrogen surplus charge should be introduced to reduce these negative external effects. Second, the excessive use of pesticides is also an important issue and has a large impact on biodiversity. There are two positive examples in Norway and Denmark for a risk class differentiated charge that should be introduced. Both together bring about more than 2 billion euros, and these revenues should be used in the agricultural sector for targeting measures in particularly sensitive areas and also for increasing acceptance. Next slide, please. Now I'm coming to the conclusions. There are at least 55 billion euros biodiversity harmful subsidies in Germany, which should be reduced. There are compensation payments for excessive use of fertilizers and pesticides that should be also introduced, providing more than 2 billion euros. And a very minor part of such additional revenues would be sufficient to upscaling the public biodiversity expenditures substantially for meeting the biodiversity objectives. The numbers are that we need about 1.4 billion euros in Germany. Currently, we only spend 0.6 billion euros. So there's a clear gap of 800 million euros which we need to fill. And shifting just a minor part of that would already be very helpful. What are the lessons learned? Well, we need courageous politicians, but also persistent administrators like you are. So I really appeal to you that you need to take action and get your politicians take action. We need regulatory monitoring and reporting, such as is happening often in various governmental reports. Like in Germany, we have a biannual subsidy report with sustainable impact assessments. That is very important because we really consider what are the impacts on environment.
So we're gonna, what we're gonna do is, if you would like to speak, Kai, maybe you can put your comments in the chat, and I hope Philippe can help you with the phone connection. But at this point, we're gonna pass the floor to Greti and Aldo for the second presentation on Italy.
Okay, hello to everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I hope my voice is good. Today we present the experience on biodiversity subsidies in Italy. And next slide, please. The Italian catalog in Italy was established by the law on green economy, and the law provide a very broad definition of subsidies which include inter alia incentive, taxes, benefits, tax credits, and exemption. We adopted two definitions very close to definition provided by OECD, and has subsidies are a state action provided an advantage in terms of revenue, income of minor cost, and a measure that either keeps prices consumer below market price level, or keep price for producers above market levels, or reduce costs for producers and consumers through direct or indirect support. We analyze both environmental friendly and harmful subsidies. Next slide, please. Our assessment follow 5 steps. First of all, the definition of the subsidies to biodiversity under the assumption that biodiversity subsidies are a subset of environmental subsidies. Second step is the review and the selection of the subsidies with potential environmental relevance, and we do that considering the existing legislative system, in particular by, first of all, examining the budget law and the tax expenditure report, then by consultation with other ministry, public authorities, and other ministries, subnational and local authorities, then by consultation with research centers, think tanks, and university. Finally, stakeholders as unions, firms, and NGO. Third step is the analysis of the environmental effect, including any positive or negative externalities that produce an effect on human well-being, health, ecosystems, and economic activity. The end of the analysis is the classification of the subsidies in friendly, harmful, and uncertain subsidies. The first step is the description with estimation and quantification of the financial effect of the subsidies. Last step is the description with estimation and quantification of the environmental impact of the subsidies. Aldo, you have the floor.
So these are the results of Italian catalog on environmentally harmful subsidies and environmentally friendly subsidies, so the larger definition of subsidies, which include also biodiversity, harmful and friendly subsidies. We have identified 116 measures. They are all in total worth 41 billion euro. Among these, we have 100 tax expenditures that we think we have covered quite completely and satisfactorily, and 61 direct subsidies through spending laws, and I think we have more work to do. The results of these estimates says that we have 19.3 billion euros of environmentally harmful subsidies, of which 16.8 billion euros of fossil fuel subsidies, and our methodology and analysis is now clear, and we are ready to go for a new step in the next editions of the catalog to quantify, to estimate precisely the biodiversity harmful subsidies. On the other side of friendly subsidies, we have estimated 15.2 billion, and we are ready to go for an estimate of biodiversity friendly subsidies. We would like to share some ideas and lessons that we have extracted from this exercise. First, reforming biodiversity friendly subsidies and eliminating biodiversity harmful subsidies remains in the hands of the political will, political decision making, as does the reusing of revenues. And we know we have many ways to recycle the revenues coming from this exercise. Transforming biodiversity harmful subsidies in biodiversity friendly subsidies, as suggested also by Kai from Germany earlier, is an interesting option. We insist on the idea that it is good to study, to identify, and to track at the same time harmful and friendly subsidies. It's a question quite clear for researchers. It's a question of transparency. It's a question of fairness, we think. We like to study biodiversity harmful and friendly subsidies in the frame of environmentally harmful and friendly subsidies, which is the larger family, and in relation with fossil fuel subsidies, because obviously we are interested in the Biodiversity Convention, but we can reinforce one another with the Climate Change Convention. So we consider that biodiversity subsidies are a subset of environmentally subsidies. We have a reference in the French report on biodiversity harmful subsidies, what is sometimes called the Saint-Denis-Marcus report. They had a very wide interpretation of biodiversity harmful subsidies. We would like to say that it was almost equal to all environmentally harmful subsidies. The recent German report introduced by Kai earlier on biodiversity harmful subsidies is also becoming an important reference. We appreciate the common methodology that we try to develop all together at OECD with OECD staff and country experts. We think it's key for advancing. Producing figures in parallel mutually strengthens national teams and global teams, international teams. An eye on Aichi Target 3, it was set in 2010. I'm afraid that by this year, the target year 2020, we are quite late and not satisfying the Aichi target. And so for experts and colleagues who are involved in the drafting and preparing the new CBD new targets, I think it's target 12 and maybe also target 2 is involved. We should avoid to have step backs. We have already lost 10 years. I think we should insist on the idea of having an ample definition and common work. And finally, a consideration on the issue of poverty reduction. Sometimes, not always, and biodiversity harmful subsidies are seen as helping the poor, helping critical sectors like agriculture and fishery. We would like to suggest that subsidies are better when they are direct and transparent. They will be more efficient. It is not a good idea to give subsidies through tools, through instruments which harm biodiversity and environment, subsidies which underprice or undervalue biodiversity and environment. Thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much to both Kai and Aldo and Greti, and also to all the participants for your patience with the technical issues. We do have some questions coming in. In a moment, we will also be launching the poll, but let me just start. There are a couple of questions for Kai. One is from Jeremy Apple, and it says, how far can you separate the impacts of subsidies to biodiversity from those that are more generally on the environment, such as on air quality and water quality? So Kai, you can take that question. I'm going to read another question as well that is for you. And while you think about that, I'm going to respond to one other question. The second question to Kai from, I believe, Mark Opel is, are there any examples of reform in Germany that have taken place in the context of biodiversity? There was also another question on whether there is any global data on subsidies harmful to forestry. We have looked at that. There was some data from several years ago, but it's not updated on a regular basis. It was a literature review, so it's not collected in a consistent and comparable way, the way that we do with this other data at the OECD, and it was quite outdated. But on that note, Kai, we can unmute you so that maybe you can respond to the first two questions.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. The first question on how can we separate impacts regarding biodiversity on the one hand and air quality and water on the other hand. Well, when we look at biodiversity impacts, really on the impacts regarding land use. So this is the predominant impact, whereas air quality is less relevant. Water is still more relevant, but it is not that easy to differentiate. What we can do is that we look at the impacts from, for example, fertilizing the ground in the agricultural sector, which it has on the groundwater. And there is a clear connection, of course. So these impacts are very important as well. On the other question, if I may follow on, the examples for reform in Germany, well, regarding climate change, and I said it's very important for biodiversity as well. Last year, it was decided by the German government to introduce a CO2 price, a carbon price, from next year on, which will be a kind of a mixture between a tax and an emissions allowance system. So this is a very important step forward after many years of debate. So from next year on, we will have such a price, and this will have positive impacts on climate change. However, I admit that unfortunately there will also be some negative reforms taken, because there will be additional possibilities for commuters by car to deduct more from their income tax, as politicians were a bit frightened that the impacts of the carbon tax might be too hard. Now, given the fact that the carbon price is so low, the oil price is so low at the moment, maybe this will still be revised, but that is unclear yet. We will see it in the further months to come.
Thank you very much, Kai. We also have a question to colleagues from Italy on how do you define a subsidy as environmentally friendly or environmentally harmful, given that a subsidy may have both environmentally friendly and environmentally harmful effects, I assume, depending on the type of environment we're looking at. I also see, so Greti and Aldo, if you would like to respond to that, that particular question. And then afterwards, I'm going to turn to Marina from Weissenberg, who I see has a hand raised. So we'll go to Marina afterwards.
Thank you. I would like to say that we also have a third category next to biodiversity friendly and biodiversity harmful subsidies, which are uncertain subsidies with mixed impacts. As the question put correctly, we have positive and negative aspects. On many subsidies, we have to go on studying, understanding, and the idea that we can try to transform some of these subsidies from negative or partially negative, partially harmful, to positive ones. It's an interesting idea we should try to follow. If I may add an element on the answer to Jeremy Apple, I would like to say that most fossil fuel subsidies harming climate are also harming biodiversity, and thereby harming water and other elements in environment and environmental policy. So I think we should start from a large list of subsidies and try to tick those subsidies which have an impact on this or that environmental media. We don't need to have a perfect separation, which is probably also theoretically and methodologically impossible. We are able to say that in Italy we have estimated 19 billion euro. In Germany they have estimated 55 billion euros of environmentally harmful subsidies. Most of them, they hit also the different aspects of policy on biodiversity, climate, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to unmute Marina, whose hand is raised. And I think afterwards, because we're running a little bit late, we're going to put up the polls. But here, Marina.
Hello. Yes, thanks. One question, and good afternoon from a sunny Helsinki, to Italy and to Aldo, and to also to Germany, to Kai's presentation. Maybe a little bit surprised hearing that we are still struggling with the definition of harmful subsidies and positive incentives. So I think, at least from the Biodiversity Convention's point of view, we have a quite clear understanding on what they are, but are we still struggling with the definition of what we mean?
I don't know what Kai thinks. I think we have sufficient convergence in among researchers to go ahead with work. To be prudent, I will call data estimates more than full quantifications. We have a number of methodological problems because from the fiscal community, for example, we have a contrast in the definition of VAT reductions. It depends on the legal framework. But we try to contribute as economists to the debate, and so we're interested in the economic and environmental ecological impact. So we have sufficient knowledge to prepare national and international catalogs, inventories. This is my point to be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if we could launch the poll, Nasera. We ask the people who are co-hosts not to respond, but everyone else, please do. So the question is, which sector in your country do you think receives the largest of subsidies that may harm biodiversity? So we're asking to tick one there. And then further down is the question on, has your country undertaken a study to identify and or assess any subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity? I think someone, Nasser, if you could launch it again, because I think someone has stopped the launch. It says polling is closed. So it says attendees are now viewing the polls. We're asking the co-hosts not to touch the poll. And for the participants.
Closed again.
Okay, so here we go. Participants are viewing. We see number of participants responding. Let's see if we can get up to maybe 100 or more. And please also take a look at the one below. Country undertaken a study to identify or assess subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity. We're past 90 now, so that's already 54. Okay, I think we can stop now. If we can close the poll, also in the interests of time primarily. And so the results for now, as I can see on my screen at least, are a large fraction on agriculture, and then coming in second is energy, followed by transport. Just a few people indicating that they do not know. And then on the second question, has your country undertaken a study to identify or assess subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity? Wow, that's a lot. So 35% of the respondents said yes, which is extremely interesting. Could I please ask those that are aware of assessments at their national level, if you would just like to type in the chat function who those are, so we can so we know who those are. I mean, that's really, really interesting. It helps to know, yeah, so that then maybe we can, when we actually organize our real physical global conference on biodiversity finance, would be great to also reach out to you to share your experiences. And interesting, yeah, a number of people do not know. But in any case, thank you so much for responding to that. I think we can now move into the second part of the discussion. So I'm going to ask if Gabriela Blatter, you would like to go ahead and take the floor with your experiences from Switzerland.
Sure, sorry, I was just sharing the screen. Can you all see the slides? Yeah, okay, good. Well, thank you for the chance to present at this virtual Biodiversity Finance Conference. I'm still super happy that this is working in a virtual room, of course with certain technical hiccups, but it's still great to see that it's working. It seems that I have similar issues to you. There you go. Now, there, changing slides. So just to give you a quick context of where our agricultural subsidy reform was placed, I think this also addresses some of the questions raised in the just previous discussion. Can you give examples of where harmful subsidies were reformed? So in our case, yes, this is a particular case of an agriculture subsidy reform. It's not perfect. There's still a lot of room for improvement, but we did record quite a significant impact, positive impact on biodiversity through the reform. Just as a context, agriculture is in Switzerland is an important, in our view, is an important positive and negative driver for biodiversity. So depending on how agriculture is done, it can have significant impacts on both sides. We already had a direct payment system established in Switzerland, which had two different categories: general direct payments and ecological payments. So there was already an ecological hook in the subsidy scheme for agriculture. And since 1990, we already had several agricultural policy reforms. So this was not the first one. That also maybe facilitated the overall discussion of reform towards a higher impact for biodiversity. And these past reforms already included the introduction of some environmental objectives, which was also key. You'll see that afterwards. So we had environmental targets, and what's also important is that our farmers have a very high dependence of the subsidy scheme. So it's a huge leverage within the sector to change that or to impact how they do business. And economically, the overall sector is not very important. So it's only 4% of employment and 0.7% of our GDP. So the overall economy doesn't depend on agriculture that much, but the farmers themselves depend hugely on the subsidy scheme. In a comparison also to OECD, I think it's an average of 18%, and ours is like 57% at this stage, or a bit lower, but it's hugely bigger than in other countries. There we go, sorry. So there were 3 different phases for the policy reform. First, there was a trigger, and I think that's important. You need to have some kind of external trigger as well for any type of reform. So in our case, it was on one side the free trade encouragements. So there was a strong push politically to have an opening towards free trade agreements, and our subsidy scheme limited that to a certain extent. And then there were some specific issues with WTO regulations. And we had an indication that the environmental targets, which had already been hooked into the reform in the past, were significantly missed. And the combination of these two then allowed for a motion to pass in one of our commissions of the parliament and triggered the reform in 2009. Then the government was tasked to reform the subsidy scheme, and then the design phase started, which and I think this maybe in other countries that are listening in is similar or it's new, but in Switzerland, very often when we do policy design, we use scientific evidence and modeling to see what the potential impacts could be of certain policy changes. And that was also done in this case. And there was a combination of interests again. And what's also specific for maybe this design in Switzerland is that we have a very broad open consultation process embedded in our political system due to direct democracy. So any policy change always is open to a very broad open consultation where every NGO, even individual people, can send in positions of whether they think the policy is useful or what they would like to change, what they like, what they dislike. And this is always analyzed in quite detail by government then after the consultation. And when the executive branch of the government takes decision in the end of what they present to parliament, the result of that open consultation is very important. And through that open consultation, because it's so broad, it often also gives a voice to smaller NGOs or groups. And in this case, for example, in agriculture, you have conflicting objectives depending on the group of farmers. So for example, the large group of high altitude farmers in Switzerland have a different position, or the biological, the farmers that use mainly bio-certified production schemes is different than, for example, let's say the position of larger farmers that have large scale, not so maybe environmentally sound production schemes in the lower areas of the country. And then the last phase in every policy reform in Switzerland, again, is the parliamentary debate. And there we had some areas of critique, like probably mostly always when you have a policy, there's always certain things which are criticized. The main issue was around the costs per, the subsidies you would get per head of cattle that was supposed to be taken away or significantly reduced. Then there were some slight adjustments made, but what's important is that the overall amount was barely touched, and that was also an important element of the overall reform, because our farmers depend so much economically on the subsidy scheme. It was kind of a front-up promise that the overall amount of subsidies wouldn't be touched, they would just be reallocated. And I think this is really important. And was also really important for the support for the policy reform. And then we were lucky in terms of timing. There was a specific political alliance that was possible between Green forces in the parliament and at that point strong Green Liberal new party that was kind of in favor of free trade objectives and in favor of biodiversity objectives. So they, of course, were very supportive of this reform, and then they went into an alliance together with the Green forces in parliament and together with the more liberal forces in parliament, very much in favor of the free trade opening or encouragements in Switzerland. And all of that then led in the end, after the discussion, to an approval in 2013 of the new policy, and it is also broadly accepted in the public now. And so here you see the bullets below. I'll show you some of the lessons learned that were also assessed by the OECD when they looked at our case as a case study. So probably one of the key elements is that we had an alliance of market-oriented and ecological interests. So just through the ecological interest, we wouldn't have been able to push for this reform in such a good way, I would say. And there also the environmental NGOs had a critical role to play in political lobbying. So they immediately jumped on this and lobbied the right politicians also on the liberal free trade side for their ecological objectives. We had a window of opportunity with conducive political environment. It's always essential how the parliament is made up when this reform happened. We had kind of a central semi-left-wing parliament. A few years after that, we had elections and it swung to the right, and probably that new parliament would have had no chance to get the reform through, because there were a lot of conservative voices in favor of like old production-based subsidy understandings. And now we just last year in the fall had elections again, and it swung back, and now it's even greener than before. It's actually a very green parliament at the moment, which is great, because we will have discussions about the new agricultural policy reform that I will just talk about in the end. And we're of course hoping that this new setup of parliament again will help us to get improvements through. What's also important is that we had a politically and socially acceptable compromise. So it was essential not to reduce the overall subsidy volume, even though there were a lot of voices from economic side to reduce them, because the farmers depend so much on them. And socially, it was very important to keep that level. So it's always important to strike a balance between the different voices in a scheme and to ensure that there's not too many losers of the reform. That brings me to the next point, to minimize impacts for losers of the reform. So this that I was talking about just briefly, the subsidy per head of cattle that we had in the system. Large-scale cattle farmers were the biggest losers in the system. And for that, we had these kind of transitional payments that would kind of compromise and balance out the socioeconomic impact for these farmers specifically, to ensure that there's no farmers going to be completely thrown off and no longer will be able to do business because we're making this policy change. So this was important also to take these more critical voices into account. And then, of course, we see there's an influence of broad consultation and public participation, and that's maybe something very specific for the Swiss system, but I do think you can introduce that in any political scheme. And through that broad consultation, as I mentioned before, you give a voice to the different stakeholder groups within the large sector of agriculture. So there's not just the big farmers which use a ton of pesticides and everything. There's lots of small scheme farmers that use very ecologically sound production schemes and so on, and they can also benefit a lot from these reallocations. And if you give these farmers a voice, then, for example, in the newspapers, there were huge articles about, oh, farmers disagree on the agricultural reform, and of course also politically for the people in Switzerland, for our mountain farmers, the high altitude farmers, they have a very high, they're very liked by the community. So that was important. Now since the case study came out, there were a few additional steps, and just quickly refer to those. So we evaluated the policy again that we introduced then, and these are some key findings that we had. So the policy showed that it's coherent and there's a high acceptance besides its complexity. So that was a strong voice, because this subsidy scheme became much more complex through the reform. A lot of people said, oh, it's going to be too complicated, but the evaluation showed that there's not a problem with that at all. The targets were achieved. So we have specific environment targets, and they were all achieved, but there's also overarching environment goals, and those were missed, especially those linked to nitrogen and phosphorus intake into the environment. So the evaluation became clear that we need a stronger coherence between the targets and the goals. So the goals speak more to the environmental quality, and the targets are more like indicator driven. And somehow there was a disconnect, or it didn't fit so well. So now we're working on a design so that they fit better, and that we actually have a stronger impact on quality based on the target-based indicators. There was a huge divergence between the various regions in Switzerland, the cantons. So there's a need for a more centralized approach, and that's being taken into this new policy reform we're working on right now. And it was also shown that we need a lot more training, and there's a need for consultant services, because many farmers wanted to integrate these things, but they didn't really know how to do that. So that will be also taken into account in the new reform. And we saw that there's a conflict of objectives very often in the agricultural subsidy scheme. That also goes to the what's harmful and what's beneficial to biodiversity, I guess. And the evaluation very clearly stated we have to avoid these conflicts of objectives in order to really get a positive impact on biodiversity. Yeah, factually that's recognized. I don't know whether that's going to play out politically very well again in the next reform, but we'll see. This is just an indication. Don't worry about the German words. It's just more to show how the subsidy scheme is continued to develop. So the middle column is the one that was assessed by the OECD in their case study, and AP 2020 Plus is the new policy reform we're working on right now. You see again the gray zone, that's these transitional payments. So again, transitional payments are foreseen to address the loser side of the policy reform. The production system, which is the violet part, is going to be increased, but increased on ecological forms of production. So there again, a strong biodiversity aspect was included. The yellow part depends on where you do agriculture, you get a higher degree of subsidies. So here, this is again to address the high altitude farmers. Biodiversity, you see the overall volume is about the same, but the target is or the objective of the reform is to get it more targeted. So this link of target and environmental goal that I was talking about before. The orange part is the kind of traditional, and the blue part, those two together are the more traditional agricultural subsidies, which are more production and area based. And those are again being reduced in comparison to what we had before. And the green shadowed in the bottom is purely ecological focused, and that's again being increased. So you see again a tendency. You see where we kind of started in 2011 with a big like bluish part, which is all production based, and just a small ecological part, now shifting to a more and more ecologically targeted subsidy scheme. The setup around the policy reform now is that we have still big issues with pesticides. And there's a few policy initiatives, public initiatives out there that we can sign on in Switzerland, these things that you can sign and vote on, which are targeted in that direction, which probably also triggered this reform a bit more within government, because government wants to avoid that these initiatives are passed. And if we can address the issues raised in the initiatives through the reform, then of course, those will not pass in a public vote. That's the basic idea. I'm not going into details of the different elements that are, again, you see the different topics that are combined in the policy reform and the bullet under new policy reform, again, showing different topics need to be combined to create drive for the policy reform. I mentioned the change in parliament before. At the end, we don't know what COVID-19 is going to impact this discussion. especially the volume of subsidy, of course, the overall volume, because it's a very big budget line in our budgets, and I don't know whether that will be impacted by the discussions we have around aftermath of COVID-19. I'll leave it at that. I hope I wasn't too long, sorry.
Thank you very much, Gabriela, for that excellent presentation. And I think already it was responding to a number of questions that were coming up beforehand. I had seen one question from Julian from AfD saying how to deal with a just transition. I think you covered that a little bit in your presentation, but I'm flagging that for afterwards as well, if you want to reflect on that. I also see a question from Zambia, which I'll come back to afterwards, a more general question. So for now, please can I pass the floor to Lira for your presentation, and then we can do the clarification questions, the poll, and the discussion afterwards.
Hello, everybody. Do you see my screen? Is it okay?
Perfect.
Okay. So the participants of virtual conference, I'm happy to welcome you today, and I would like to present you our presentation, Reform and Harmful Agricultural Subsidies Towards Green and Organic Agriculture. So it's one of the 4 financial solutions that is being implemented under the second phase of Biofin in Kyrgyzstan. Preliminary study was and we identified 34 subsidies in 4 sectors of economy: agriculture, energy, transport, and heating. 20 potentially harmful, we considered, and 12 are biodiversity friendly ones. So to save time, the logic of my presentation is to present at first those subsidies that we are going to address in phase 2, and then to give some overview how we identified them and next steps in reforming or greening them. Just to inform you that we are only on this initial stage of our journey for reforming subsidies. So agriculture is an important sector in Kyrgyzstan, which is 12% of GDP. 11 subsidies have been identified in agriculture sector, and among them 8 are potentially harmful for biodiversity. We selected 3 subsidies, those potentially to be reformed. They are on the left side and marked with brown pictograms. The first, it's a charge or tariff on for on-farm irrigation water supply. Currently, they are very low, and this incentivizes farmers to apply water-saving practices. Government bears the cost of the construction, maintains and repair of irrigation channels and lines, while using loans of international financial institutions. And instead of with subsidies, we relied also on OECD analysis. Economic instrument for water resource management in Kyrgyzstan. And the proposed reform will include the, for example, development and introduction of new tariff policy for irrigation water supply, just to calculate the real price of water delivered for farmers and other. The second subsidies, it's interest rate subsidies on loans to agricultural producers and exporters. It is implemented through the governmental agricultural finance program. Government, also funded by IFIs, subsidize expenses of financial and credit organizations from the public budget for replacement of loans at preferential interest rates. Environmental criteria for crediting are unlikely to be met by farmers. So to reform the subsidies, to introduce the incentive green loans to agricultural producers with grant elements financed from national budget. And third, subsidies, exemption from import VAT on supply of mineral fertilizers, pesticides, and chemical plants protection products. there is a list of chemicals which are exempted from import VAT, and the proposed reform will aim the cancellation of the VAT exemption policy on imported agrochemicals and stimulation to use environmental friendly fertilizers. In fact, existing subsidies fail to improve the welfare of farmers. They are also disincentivized for farmers to adopt green or organic practices. And agriculture subsidies currently cost to government more than $38 million a year, which equal to 2.3% of the total national budget. Around half of this amount of money could be potentially repurposed, and these harmful subsidies can be reverted to the biodiversity-friendly subsidies, and best areas are the following: supporting organic agriculture. We have the concept for development of organic agriculture for 2017-2022. In under implementation Kyrgyzstan, but there is not progressing because of lack of funds. For example, there is no specific budget allocation for organic agriculture in the law or national budget for the next 2 years. Another area is sustainable irrigation or introduction of the water-saving technology. This is priority often declared in the strategic country documents related to this sustainable development, but in fact it's not supported financially. Release funds will allow to support to introduce the water-saving technologies like drip irrigation, and I would call these two areas quasi-subsidies because there are policies to introduce them, but we do not know how much money is spent government to fund organic agriculture and sustainable irrigation. And the second slide, just shortly, how we identify the subsidies. We use the methodology of biofin work group. Also, we were guided to methodology case studies of OECD and UNEP. And there is a 5-step process was adopted. The first is identification of subsidies based on results of institutional review. Biofin expert analyzed the budget, tax, sectoral legislation, strategic program reports, analytical reports to reveal government actions that confirms as an advantage on consumers or producers in order to supplement the income or reduce the cost. All actions meet into this criteria. We included into initial list of subsidies. Then the second step was to screen. Just its algorithm looks simple, but it required intensive information and data for analysis. And so we differentiated 3 categories of subsidies: neutral, harmful, and positive. And on the third step, we also analyze the subsidies, whether it can be strengthened if it's positive, whether the harmful subsidies can be removed, reform or phase out, or neutral can be transferred to the positive. If answer yes, then we selected them to the next steps and also check on 4 criteria on social importance, on influence on public budget, and political relevance, because some of them are very sensitive and there is strong resistance from politicians, and also their compliance to the principles of sustainable development. And the 5th stage, it's exactly the reforming. So this is our workflow, how we will work with our assignment on reforming subsidies. So the first 2 we have been already done, and we are on the 3rd stage, analysis of reform options to develop concrete policy reform options based on multiple scenario analysis to prioritize subsidies to be selected, to be reducted, greened, or phased out. And fourth step, to develop action plan, which must consider following required regulation, compensation mechanisms to assess who will lose, the vulnerable groups, and advocacy plan and capacity building. And the fifth, it's final to draft regulatory documents, national debates, communication, and advocacy. So to implement this plan, we will have a team of experts composed of leading international expert, national expert, and with great support of our colleagues from PAGE, Partnership for Action on the Green Economy, and UNEP colleagues. So we have the wide partnership network, and also we are supported by the current member of parliament. We will have selection in parliament, and we still rely that the green people, green member of parliament will come in you. And we managed to help them to establish interagency working group on reforming harmful subsidies, which was done last year after our site event devoted to the harmful subsidies during the Green Economy Week. So we have also good communication with Ministry of Agriculture. They recently established Department of Organic Farming, and they also need to promote and need help. Ministry of Economy, so they are responsible for the promotion of Green Agenda, and Ministry of Finance. Still, there are a lot of politicians that are still resistant, and we are trying to do our advocacy work. And all our work will be supported by strategic documents, Green Economy Development Concept. It's adopted by Parliament. Also, under the ministry, there is a government program on green economy adopted last year. The NBSAP also included the important activities on removing the harmful subsidies for biodiversity. Also, the concept of organic agriculture development and biodiversity finance plan that was developed by Biofuel team. So this is shortly about the work for Biofuel.
Thank you so much, Lira, also for that excellent presentation. That's really, really helpful, and also I think helps to provide insights on the actual reform, which a number of participants were asking about before. There were a lot of questions on the side, and I also see there's interaction between the panelists and the speakers, but there were two clarification questions, which I'd like to come to first. The first was from Kazakhstan to Gabriela, and the question is, does your government plan to introduce subsidies also for organic farming? So that was, I guess, an easy yes/no response. The second clarification question was for Lira, and it says, when you say organic farming, when you refer to organic farming, does this mean you also promote native crops versus non-native crops? So if I can just quickly pass the floor to Gabriela and then Lira for those two questions, then we're going to go to the poll and go into the broader questions afterwards.
Yes, you get subsidies for the production, for organic production, and you get subsidies for environmental outcomes of your organic production. So additional things you do in order to produce organically.
Thank you. And Lira?
Okay, the question regarding the native crops, and I don't see this question. Okay, of course, we if we are talking about organic farming, we are talking about the native crops. But of course, if there is some culture that may be beneficial, will bring benefits and import it abroad, we will also look at this.
Okay, there were a number of other questions. One of them, for example, was from Zambia, about 1.5 million farmers who depend on one of the largest subsidy programs, including inputs on subsidized rates of synthetic fertilizers and how to best reform this. I saw there were exchanges also with Kai and others, and I see Aldo raising his hand too. But what I'd like to do is first, if we can quickly move to the poll, just to start off with in that regard. So Nasera, if you could launch that poll. We're going to keep the poll open for a bit longer this time, I think. So probably for, well, this is an easier poll, so maybe we don't need to keep it up for that long, but we'll keep it open for maybe a minute. And in the meantime, Aldo, I saw you had raised your hand. Would you like to take the floor now, since...
Yes. The point raised by Joshua from Zambia is extremely interesting, is how we treat the agricultural sector, especially the small peasants, and in different ways and dimensions and degrees. I think we have a common problem in all of our countries, whatever the level of so-called economic progress and development. Some of our subsidies are historically set for good environment, good economic and social reasons. There is a motivation, obviously, behind the subsidies. From time to time, the reason has gone out, and so we should analyze also the historical legal origin of the subsidies. But what is the point, I think, that Joshua is raising is that a country or a group of countries may decide that politically, socially, they want to help the poor, or they want to help a specific productive sector. In Joshua's example, the small farmers and the agricultural sector. We have the same problem in Italy as well. What probably comes out from trying to identify and track the subsidies is that we have alternative ways. At OECD, we've been working on this for many years with the OECD experts and national experts, and we've seen that there are alternative measures. We don't need necessarily to discount or underprice products or services which are harmful to biodiversity. We can give direct subsidies to those that we politically, socially, morally think we must help. What is important is to design the subsidies in a way which doesn't harm biodiversity or climate or environment in general. And we have technical tools for doing this.
Thank you very much. What I see here, so I think we've just closed the poll. We have from nearly 100 people who voted that around 40% says yes, your country has reformed or is in the process of reforming. That's wonderful. Could I ask those who have, again, reformed, if they could like to, maybe in the chat box, we're gonna collect this afterwards. I mean, it's a great resource base also for us. If you could say what has been reformed, which country, which sector, and then you know, maybe we can follow up with you afterwards. This is exactly the sort of thing that helps to, you know, if we can do further analysis like we did on the political economy of biodiversity policy reform, to bring together examples, exchange, do analysis, research on the advantages, disadvantages, and extract lessons learned from that for best practice. There was another question, if we can move more to the discussion format now. There were some, I think, also interesting questions on, for example, to Gabriela, indicating, so have you done impact studies to actually look at the impacts of this on biodiversity, and you didn't show your indicators, I believe was the comment. What do you have data on trends in this regard in Switzerland? That was specifically to you, yes.
Yes, so we do, the evaluation I showed is, I don't know, 300 pages long. It has a huge set of comparing the environmental goals with the indicators and which was met and why not, and why there's a disconnect and so on, which targets one of the questions, do you have a trend? And yeah, it really matters on what you measure and what your target is. So we had like maybe more outcome-oriented goals, which was like lower intake of nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment and things like that. Mm-hmm. And then we had targets to the farmers, which were more targeted towards how they operate, which were biologically relevant, area-based, and so on. And we thought originally that when they meet these targets, we will ultimately achieve the objective of reducing the nitrogen intake, for example, but that was not the case. So this is exactly what the evaluation showed, and that's what we're trying to do now, is to redefine these farmer-oriented targets in order to better achieve the overall objectives. So this is kind of what we're working on. But since I only had 8 minutes, I have no chance to get into that. It's like a 30 slide presentation just on that we have.
Of course, Gabriela. We do have the space for LinkedIn. So if there's more information, we've put together the LinkedIn, and thanks also really to UNDP for setting that up. For people to use that space as well as a way to exchange information and to talk amongst yourselves as well. So please feel free to use that. I'll highlight the website afterwards. We are running a bit over time, nearly, or we will be. I would like to keep the session open for just a little bit longer. There is a question here, which I think is an important one, and it's how to quantify the magnitude of impacts of harmful subsidies to biodiversity. So I'd like to open that to anyone who wants to respond. I think it's a really important and critical question. Could I see if any of the panelists would like to take that on, or indeed any other country that has conducted an assessment? I saw France, Mexico, Finland, and Norway had also undertaken assessments to identify and assess their harmful subsidies. But again, the question is, how do you quantify the magnitude of impacts of these harmful subsidies on biodiversity? Can you give 1 or 2 examples, short responses, if possible? If maybe any of the panelists want to raise their hand, I can look through the screen to see. No, I don't see anyone raising their hand. Okay, so maybe we can come to that question at another time. I see a comment from Didier Babin, and we do want to also try and take this to the bigger picture issues. Didier says it's important to include evaluation of subsidies harmful for biodiversity in accountability system and monitoring, review, and report systems from countries in the CBD context. I wanted to sort of raise a question also in this regard with the CBD. How can we achieve progress in this regard in the post-2020 framework? For the current Aichi Target 3, we had the text. The OECD is providing data on the trends in environmentally harmful agricultural support from the OECD countries, at least on this regard. But how can we try and make further progress on this in the post-2020 framework? Would it be helpful to have more milestones in a post-2020 agreement, more indicators, etc.? I'm opening that up if people would like to respond in the chat, or if someone else would like to raise their hand if they'd like to respond. Sylvia saying we'd need more baseline data on biodiversity and at finer scale so that we can monitor trends. We do have in the SDG framework, we have target 14.6, which is also specific to the harmful fisheries subsidies. In a sense, that's the Aichi Target 3 currently is the broadest one, is broader than that. Would anyone like to pick up on these bigger picture issues? Thank you. At least I see you. I don't see others, so I'm...
Yeah, so I'll just, I don't think I can raise a hand with my usual participants.
You can't, no. Yeah.
So, I don't know if like more detailed indicators in the framework would really help, because the important first step is what we've heard from Italy and Germany, is to actually assess what you have. and many countries don't know that. We also haven't really done a really thorough overall assessment yet. It's still in the planning, and my colleague who's doing that is also joining on the conference. But so that's kind of the starting point. Now, if you can anchor that in the framework as a target that you have to assess your subsidy schemes. But it's at the same time, it's also one of the most politically touchy things. And we also heard from Lyra, some subsidies are really hard to remove simply because, yeah, there is a strong political support for them for their various reasons, and biodiversity objectives are not as high on the political agenda as the target of that specific subsidy. That's just the reality. And I wonder whether more specific targets or something in this framework would really change that. Maybe it's a bit too negative, but yeah, in the political realities we operate, we have to take that into account. I think more pragmatic targets where actually you say countries have to assess their subsidy flows domestically, which is maybe a lot more downscale and operational, might actually help more than some fancy additional indicators.
Okay, would anyone else like to, I see Aldo raising his hand, thank you.
We are producing data, we are producing analysis, and we can and must improve. I would like to stress this idea, but we can work at national level. If you find a small group of economists and ecologists possibly working together in ministries, in agencies, but also in think tanks, we may ask the help of universities. Very often researchers at universities may be available. It is possible to start this exercise. And we're certainly much further than we were 10 or 20 years ago in awareness and in estimation. Then obviously there are the political problems and we must build the consensus, but this is something as a technical expert I leave to politicians. It is important that we go ahead and we increase the data. I had, the chat is a little bit distracting, sorry about that. Andrew from the Global Canopy was asking if we are distinguishing between tax rebates and direct payments. We are in Italy, I think also Germany and Mexico and other attempts are doing this. Silvia from Italy is suggesting that some analysis on agricultural subsidies, if they are harmful or friendly, can be updated and improved. It's very welcome. Alejandro from Cornell gave also some very interesting suggestions of things we should work on. But knowing that there is an increasing community of experts working together on these matters is extremely important, because obviously there is not only the biodiversity, environmental policy issues, it is related to other objectives of our governments and of the international community. But we can do this in a different way. I think this is an important message to bring home.
Thank you very much, Aldo. It is kind of, I mean, I think it's great to be able to have this discussion here, but I really wish that we could have done this in live format, the way that we had originally planned to do it between OECD and UNDP. We are looking forward to hosting the real event, you know, when time permits. And I think, I mean, there seems to be a lot of appetite on this issue. And also I see from comments on the need to further share lessons, learn from each other, etc. So we would definitely have that in the agenda for the real meeting, where they also meet in the corridors and discuss, etc., and exchange from all the different, because there seem to be more and more examples, and we'd really like to harness that. And what are the capacities needed here? What were the challenges there, etc. We are running a bit over time, so I'd like to thank everyone. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the technical issues in the beginning. I'm really sorry about that. I'd like to thank all the speakers that attended, and of course all the participants that shared their time with us here today, and all the people working behind the scene to support this and to be able to put this in place. If I could ask Ines to load the last slide. which covers, please do join us today at 3 o'clock Paris time. Session 4 is on estimating finance needs and developing effective biodiversity plans with examples from the Philippines, Colombia, India, and Mexico. And of course, please do then also join us next week, same time, same channel, the 29th of April for our final day series, with session 5 being on the private sector and financial sector, and session 6 looking at towards the post-2020 framework. Please also note we have set up a LinkedIn group. It's called Global Conference on Biodiversity Finance. You can search through the LinkedIn method to find that. We do also have a link elsewhere for that, which I think we shared to you via email. But with that, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone. And we hope to see you again at 3 o'clock today. All the best.